All right, I'm going to switch gears again to English again. Okay, so I think we talked about healthcare, we talked about batteries, climate as well. So I want to go back to climate again. So I think UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, were proposed in 2012. So it's been 12 years. Looking ahead, what key policy changes or initiatives do you believe it's essential for driving technology and the adoption of the different solutions globally?
Important question, Jason, and thank you for that. I think we've got completely off track with the SDGs. We saw in the last 3 years with COVID, where the UN Secretary General is calling about rescuing the SDGs. And what is clear is that we are, for the first time post the Second World War, we are seeing an interlocking crisis. We've seen a crisis of health with the COVID pandemic and showed the fragility of human health and health systems. The second is a crisis of the climate, which is hanging like the sword of the Damocles over humanity, whether it was Hurricane Ian in Florida, which upended lives and livelihoods, or the floods we've seen in Europe and China, and today in 2022 in Pakistan, 60% of the country was underwater. So it is clearly a major challenge. Then we have ongoing conflicts. It's not just Ukraine and Gaza. We have 70 ongoing conflicts. So it is really a polycrisis, so to speak. But quite clearly, climate affects everybody. And therefore, we have to look at avenues where technology, innovation, big data can help us overcome some of the critical challenges. How do we make sure that we stay faithful to the Paris Agreement? And therefore, to me, events like Beyond Expo that you've started, Jason, and big credit to you for doing that, is how do we harness new partnerships? We've been talking about green tech. We are talking about EV, where China has already become 60% electric vehicle all over the cities. I think what we need to now do is find a new multilateral space of bringing nation states, and not just nation states, but public-private partnerships in order to give velocity to the climate agenda, because quite clearly that 1.5 degrees centigrade rise may become completely unachievable unless we get together to deal with it. We are going to see extreme temperatures. The Secretary General has already warned that from global warming, we have gone to global boiling. So that is something that we have to remain mindful of.
How about John?
Yeah, as we think about climate, right? Climate affects and impacts more than just, kind of the environment. This is it's a health issue. In the end, it's an earnings issue and a thriving communities issue. It's something that we, when we think about the SDGs, they're all intricately linked to how it is we solve climate in the end. And so we have to solve climate in ways that build and grow all of the different aspects and address all the SDGs simultaneously. We've talked a lot about EVs here. Certainly, when you look at a place like Delhi and the current health issues related to all of the pollution that's in the air there are largely a result of the vehicular traffic that are there. And today in Delhi, it's actually a quarter the cost right now to drive an EV as a two-wheeler or a three-wheeler than it is to drive an internal combustion engine one. But the system isn't set up to support that right now. You actually pay 3 times the interest rate on an electrified two-wheeler or three-wheeler that you do on an internal combustion engine one. But if we can shift over, if we can make this transition, you actually wind up saving tremendous amounts of money. You wind up minimizing local air pollution. You wind up creating new economies and new abilities to grow. And this is true not just in India, but throughout the global south. In a place like Nigeria, if you switch to 2- and 3-wheeled electrification, you wind up saving about $1,000 for one person over the 8-year lifetime of that particular vehicle. That's like a massive boost. That's almost half a year's worth of pay in Nigeria that you're saving by shifting and embracing some of these new technologies.
Yeah. So I think when you mention about this, there's one thing that has been bothering me quite a bit these days is, so recently US has imposed a way higher tax on EV cars coming from China to 100%. So I think suppose EV, when you just mentioned, it's about how the policies are affecting it for like 3 times the interest rate and all these tariffs. Like what would you, how would you see countries putting tariffs on something that is supposed to be helping the environment instead of hurting, right? EV cars, batteries and all that, they even impose it on medical equipment, which I really don't get it. They claim that China has surplus production and overcapacity. So these kind of terms are something that has been bothering me. I hope that I think it bothers some of us as well. What are your take on it?
Yeah, it's an important question here, Jason. And we are facing a planetary emergency right now. And that emergency can be solved best if China and the United States and the EU and those countries that can lead can support each other and work together to solve in the end. Now, China took an amazing early leadership position, right? And right now, it actually has more than 80% of the supply chain in 11 of the 14 most important clean tech sectors, which is were it not for that, the world would be in a much more precarious position right now. So thank goodness China stepped forward. But there are questions and challenges that other countries would have around, well, how do we diversify supply chains and make sure that there's a resilient global structure? And I see that this is an opportunity for China to work together with the rest of the world to help do what exactly China's great growth that it's experienced here over the past 30 years has in part been because of joint venturing, has been because it has combined the best of outside China with inside China. And I think now China needs to do some of that same here going forward and create the joint ventures and share some of the knowledge and wealth and understanding so that everybody can rise to the challenge of this planetary emergency. And simultaneously, we build robust industrial supportive practices that really do nurture and create a world that is thriving, verdant, and secure, right?
So I think follow up with Sid as well. I think my other question is, as I said, it's suppose these EV cars and batteries are good for the environment, right? So from UN standpoint, or from your perspective, you often talk about multilateralism. How can we continue with that if there's imposing different, it's only for me, quote unquote, nonsense tariffs on certain countries?
You know, Jason, back in 2022, I wrote a piece in CNBC that, if US and China collaborate, they can save the world when it comes to the current planetary crisis that we are witnessing. And I was very happy that 2023, much more exchanges happened. Jon Kerry's visit, that time Special Envoy Xie. I'm thrilled that Liu Jianmin has now become the new Special Envoy, a dear friend of mine who was a former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. I quite agree with him. I mean, the key point is we will need the leadership of China. We will need the leadership of the United States. We will need the leadership of the European Union, all coming together, because together they have the bandwidth, the intellectual capital, the resources to be able to make that. We need a leapfrog moment. We cannot just transition on. We need a leapfrog moment, which means that countries have to remain faithful towards the commitment, and particularly the developed countries have to remain faithful to their commitment of putting in that $100 billion a year for climate change adaptation. Well, we are happy to see the loss and damage fund is coming, but I'm much more optimistic, by the way, now than I was in 2022, because in 2022, ultimately, the US and China did get together in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and it was a reasonably good result. So I think I'm seeing progress there. We have to park geopolitics aside when it comes to the climate, because everybody's affected by it, And here is something which is very interesting. Why the multilateral space is so crucial is that previously when Beijing used to get the sandstorms, it used to come from Inner Mongolia. I would encourage a lot of people, I don't know how many have been there, is to go visit the Kubuchi Desert. It's the 7th largest desert in China. It is an agricultural wonderland. It produces 3.2 gigawatts of electricity from solar and wind. And the solar panels and the wind panels are so high that they've utilized the real estate below these panels. And it's a complete convergence of technology and innovation. that place has a per capita GDP which is higher than that of the national average. Now, this is the kind of knowledge of combating desertification with the advent of technology and innovation that we can bring to bear in places like sub-Saharan Africa. If you don't have the sandstorms stopped in Mongolia, you will still continue to get sandstorms in Beijing. So the key is you have to have a multilateral space in the climate agenda. Air pollution, important point he made. It's killing 7 million people a year. Now, Beijing has cleared up its air. I run half marathons every month in Beijing. It has perhaps one of the best AQI levels. But I mean, what happens when the climatic conditions or pollutants from other parts of China come into the Beijing space? So I think we will have to look at the entire whole, and therefore the community of nations has to come together. So I think the Secretary General has been absolutely faithful to his call to action that, look, we have to deal with the climate agenda. And here, again, I want to commend President Xi for the clearest articulation on the climate agenda when he said that China will go for carbon peaking by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. I think now what we, as the UN, are doing is working with the Chinese government to look at what kind of innovation and big data and technology can we do. But at the same time, what I'm urging the government to do and working with my counterparts in other countries is what kind of knowledge can we share with them from this experience.
Right. So when you touch on technologies going to different developing countries, I think the next question for both is how can we ensure the climate tech innovations are accessible and also affordable for people in need in these?
Yeah, so this is not just a challenge, this is an opportunity, right? When we think about it, the scale of the investment that's required it's roughly $100 trillion here over the next 25 years. Now, right now, that investment is massively skewed when we look at kind of the overall geography of it. The United States, as a country, invests about 60 times more than Africa as a continent, for instance, right? And we have to rectify that. We have to shift and provide some acupuncture into the system that gets capital flowing much differently than it does right now. And that capital has to do three big things, right? One is there are assets out there that are carbon intensive that cannot run to their end of life, right? And we have to shut them down before they actually fully run to economics, because we can't afford to have all of that carbon in the atmosphere. And so we need to create mechanisms like carbon trading and other mechanisms that help support that transition. And areas like Indonesia and Vietnam right now, where the just energy transition partnerships are moving, are helping to create some of the funds and financing mechanisms that allow us and support these countries in the transition there. But then we've got to do two other things, right? We've got to get innovation moving faster. Innovation, especially in the hard-to-abate sectors, especially in areas like steel, cement, like aluminum, heavy freight, shipping, et cetera. These ideas are going to come from all over the world, and we need to support and ensure that the venture to equity and the equity to bank financing all aligns there. And then third, we've got to scale the solutions that already exist out there, right? And this is the area where the most reform needs to happen so that we can de-risk, kind of the pipelines of projects that need to go in throughout the global south that are necessary, that provide that leapfrog that Sid mentioned earlier, that give the new economics, but that has to be done through coordinated multilateral bank support, right, to de-risk alongside private capital that flows in and recognizes and repeats, kind of the opportunity to ensure that mini grids and microgrids, to ensure that solar, to ensure that electric vehicles all move very quickly to the places that need them the most, which are the fastest growing areas of the world that need that support.
Here it's simple economics. How did China make this leapfrog within itself, with a per capita GDP at $180 in 1979? It was about scale and volume and achieving economies of scale. And this is precisely what we need. We need high tech to get very cheap, but consumption will be huge. Now, that is the opportunity that opens up. In fact, I've served half my life in Africa. Africa needs a leapfrogging into the fourth industrial revolution. It doesn't necessarily have to go through, the typical rise of Europe and China and the rest of the world. They can actually jump into the fourth industrial revolution. In fact, I tell many partners this in Beijing. I say, Africa by 2050 will have 2.5 billion people. And they will have 900 million young people. They will be the future of consumption and production that will happen. Invest now, you will have a huge return of investment into the future. But what is important is, this is one area where China can define a way forward in this climate transition that is there, because of the amount of innovation, the amount of knowledge there is. The place where the world has to come together is to look at how do we become more efficient at carbon capture. Now, that is one place which we are way behind. And while technology is moving forward, we've not been able to kind of diagnose that space there. Can you imagine if we can look at an entire continent like Africa for carbon capture? It could actually be a solution to many of the challenges that we are already confronted with. So I think this would need, again, the resurrection of multilateralism, and that's why the Secretary General is hosting the Summit of the Future. It's a once in a generation, it's a lifetime opportunity to look at how do we reposition multilateralism so that at least we can converge around the issues that challenge us: health, climate, conflicts, inequalities, economic disruptions. These are the places where people can come together, because, the aspirations of an African parent is no different from the aspiration of a Chinese parent or that of an American parent. It is about the future. And the future is really to make sure that the climate impact is now sustained. Because one thing is clear: it is impacting food security, it is impacting health. Today, 800 million people are going to bed hungry every night because of droughts and famine, and of course, instability, and all these things are contributing to it.
So I want to follow up on that as well, because before becoming the RCO of China, you were in Kenya. So because we've known each other for more than 5 years, 4 to 5 years. I think you've been telling me a lot of stories about how Chinese companies are helping a lot of good climate tech solutions going to the Belt and Road initiatives, including Africa as well. Can you share some examples that you see during the time you were in Kenya?
Well, first of all, I want to call out Ambassador Liu. We served in Kenya together at a time when Kenya itself was looking at transitioning. I was the resident coordinator in Kenya, and I got involved in a discussion with the Kenyan government when there was a discussion going on with China about connecting the airport to downtown. Because on an average, if you came out from Jomo Kenyatta Airport, it could take about 3 to 4 hours in peak traffic just to get about 25, 30 kilometers into that. So it used to be a nightmare, and you could just get stuck there. So when this thing happened, I brought all our economists together. I said, let's do a plan. Let's go back to the Kenyan government with a proposal. The proposal that we made was, look, make it easier for an FDI to happen, for a foreign direct investment to happen. We did a calculation based on a toll that would be collected, that in 15 years' time, they would get nearly 2.5 times the return on that. Put that onto the table, advise the Ministry of Treasury and the minister himself, who's a dear friend, who used to be the former governor in one of the northern provinces of Kenya, went back to the table. There was no disagreement on that. Easy and good to go. Today, that road is not just built in record time, but of course, the Chinese speed of implementing things. But what I told the government was, make sure that we don't have those difficulties where land gets grabbed and, So the government took care of that part. The road has been built, record time, actually below budget.
Oh.
So remarkable piece of this thing. I went there last year and I couldn't believe it, because the road was being constructed while I was there, but the speed with which it was implemented. But I see, this is going to be the future of Africa. We are talking about the Belt and Road. We are talking about the global gateway from Europe. If you look at post-Second World War Europe, the Marshall Plan that America put in place was a BRI effort. It connected Europe, and that led to the creation of the European Union. This is exactly what we need in Africa for the Africa Continental Free Trade Area to happen. It'll create the jobs, but we can actually take a green trajectory in Africa's growth.
So this is a question for Jon. So as the CEO of RMI, what role do you see for public and private partnerships in scaling up investment and developing climate tech solutions?
Yeah, so public-private partnerships are at the core of how this whole energy transition needs to happen, right? And when we think about scaling, yesterday I was here over at Southern China Hydrogen Energy Association, right? Which is a group here down in Guangzhou that is focused specifically on how do you bring a hydrogen economy into being. And in order for that to happen, you've got to align research, you've got to align capital, you've got to ultimately get whole sets of infrastructure to jump at the same time to a wholly different cost base. And when you start doing that as a system, you wind up actually creating the viability for something new to take hold and to grow and to be competitive. And that doesn't happen on its own. You need an independent nonprofit in the middle, or a collaboration between government and for-profit and civil society institutions to align all the different stakeholders that sit together on that. And that's true for hydrogen. That's true if you want to realign the global aviation industry. That's true if you want to deal with global shipping. You need to get a combination of the industry, the customers, the financiers, and the policymakers to all build the ratchet mechanism that then allows everything to move just a little bit differently, and then kind of ultimately you're able to transform. And we're seeing that happen. We're seeing that happen in aviation and some of the leadership on that front around SAF. We're seeing that happen around shipping and with some of the new work that the IMO is doing and moving toward zero carbon fuels here going forward. We're seeing that happen in steel, right? Where you're seeing buyers' alliances aligning on different aspects of what exactly constitutes low carbon steel and how do we certify it and track it and trace it. These are all the necessary impacts, but they are made easier when you've got actually that coordination in the middle and entities like the UN, entities like RMI, entities like the South China Hydrogen Energy Association working in the middle to help make that whole system change.
Right. So let's go to our lightning rounds for people to get to know you more. Okay. So for Jon, if you could have any superpower to combat climate change, what would it be?
Well, fossil fuels have gotten us to where we are today. But I wish I could just snap my fingers, right, and have everybody forget and stop believing that they are the source of safety and security in the world. Because the truth is, when we look at where we are today, the conflicts, when we look at the concentration of wealth, when we look at the air pollution, when we look at the climate pollution that we're seeing, fossil fuels are not serving us well anymore. And in fact, when we look at renewables, wind and solar are the cheapest new form of energy for 95% of the people on the planet. When you start coupling that with some of the innovations that's happening in batteries that we heard Robin talk about earlier, we can see our pathway to a much cleaner, more sustainable and secure energy future if we can just let ourselves believe that it can happen, right? And drive toward it rather than believing that we've got to constantly go back to the belief that fossil fuels are more secure.
Yeah. So, Sid, if you could magically make one everyday item completely sustainable, what would it be?
I would say the air conditioner. I think the air conditioner is the most polluting and gas emitting thing that is there. But without it, we won't be able to do our work. So I hope we find a way to make air conditioning accessible to everyone on the planet. No one be left behind in the principles of the SDGs, but it must be a sustainable model of sustaining people's lives and livelihoods.
Okay, so I just want to comment on what you've just mentioned previously. I think when you talked about technology having high volume, that it could be sold in a very cheap price, I think that's the mindset of Chinese technologies hoping to achieve, right? So back to the questions that I think it's bothering me, because I think if you add tariffs to these kind of good technologies, it contradicts to what we believe, right? High volume and high price, right? Because it's oversupplied, right? So I think that is something that I'm not sure if you guys wanted to comment on this, but then I think this is something that some politicians have to think when they impose such, I would say, nonsense to certain, because they might not be competitive in some field. That's why they're adding tariffs onto that industry. So I'll leave to that. So I don't want to put you guys in an awkward situation anymore. But thank you for joining us today, and I hope you guys can visit Macau more.